Today, a brother shared his story with us. After he died, he was taken to hell, where he came face to face with a globally infamous terrorist. This terrorist had a startling message, particularly for Muslims, and it's important to hear it. Make sure to watch until the end.
I am Liam Oliver. Whenever I attempted to share my experience, people would either laugh at me or label me as crazy. They would mockingly ask, "How could you die and see a Muslim in hell? How is it that you didn't encounter your ancestors or family members there, but instead saw well-known historical figures like Osama bin Laden?" Their doubts made me start to question myself. However, deep inside, I knew my experience was true. After watching a testimony on this channel, all the memories I had tried to forget came rushing back in a vivid dream. It felt as if God himself was urging me to speak up and share my story, no matter how others might react. Now, I'm sharing my experience because I believe someone needs to hear this. It all began during a business trip. My company sent me on a week-long mission from March 5th to March 10th, 2024, to close an important deal. They arranged for me to stay in an extravagant hotel with elegant rooms, high-end amenities, and a gorgeous swimming pool where I spent most of my downtime relaxing. On the last day of my stay, the business deal was finalized early, giving me 2 more days to enjoy the hotel. I decided to go for one final swim before leaving, a routine I often used to clear my head. That morning, everything felt unusual. As I got into the pool and began my regular laps, an unsettling feeling took over. My heart began to race, and my breathing grew fast and shallow. Despite my best efforts to stay afloat, it felt as though the water was dragging me down, and I couldn't reach the edge. The fight to keep myself above the water became too much, and in my desperate attempts to breathe, I ended up swallowing water. Everything around me became a blur as my limbs grew heavy, and I eventually sank below the surface. My vision went completely dark. When I lost consciousness, it felt like everything I knew just vanished instantly. There was no tunnel of light or calming image of my body drifting in the pool as some near-death experiences describe. Instead, I ended up in a whole new place. When I looked around, I found myself walking, though I had no clue where I was. It felt strange, cold, dark, and far off. I ended up on a wide path, big enough for many souls to walk beside me. The path had a spooky feeling to it, but at first I couldn't clearly see anything about the people around me. I wasn't even sure if I was wearing clothes or not. A heavy sense of fear overcame me as I walked, feeling as if my steps were guided by something else. There was no option to turn back, and an unseen force seemed to push me onward. The path ahead was unclear, but I could feel that something was terribly amiss. As I continued walking, the discomfort grew stronger. Initially, the pain was mild, almost like a persistent ache. But soon, I started noticing the others around me, and their suffering was far more severe. As we continued, the pain of those around me became increasingly unbearable. Their desperate and horrifying cries echoed through the thick darkness. The path grew even darker, and it dawned on me where I had ended up in hell. The shock of this truth was immense. I had always believed that as a Christian, living rightly and following God's will would keep me safe from such a fate. Yet, here I was, exactly in the place I had been taught to fear throughout my life. I couldn't comprehend how this could happen. How could I, someone who had dedicated their life to God, end up here? As we moved ahead, the pain within me stopped escalating, but the suffering of those around me grew worse. Their cries and the terror in their expressions intensified with each step. We moved at an unreal speed, faster than anyone could run, yet without feeling tired. It felt like an unseen force was pushing us toward a terrifying and unavoidable fate. Ahead, the path spread out into a huge pit, a deep hole leading to endless torment. I stood at the brink, watching as souls were cast into the pit, their screams growing louder as they fell into the fiery chasm. The scene in front of me was impossible to grasp. The pit was not merely hot, it was filled with a churning, molten substance that looked like lava. The souls trapped within were writhing in pain, their bodies twisted and burned from the extreme heat. It wasn't only the fire that caused their torment. Terrifying, monstrous creatures roamed the pit, delivering brutal punishment to the souls trapped inside. These nightmarish beasts seemed to exist solely to intensify the suffering of those condemned. Even more terrifying were the tiny, insect-like creatures, perhaps maggots or something even worse, that swarmed around and inside the bodies of the suffering souls. Their movement caused intense agony as they burrowed into the flesh of those in torment. I was paralyzed by the horror of it all, my heart breaking at the sight of such relentless suffering. The screams of the suffering souls echoed around me, filling me with deep sadness and terror. I couldn't tear my gaze away. Even though the scene was so horrific, it felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. As I stared deeper into the pit, I realized the torment was unending and eternal punishment with no way out. Then, I noticed a particular section where the suffering was even more severe. In that area, the creatures were particularly active, and the pain experienced by the souls there was far greater. Gradually, an invisible force seemed to pull me toward that section of the pit. That's when I saw him, Osama bin Laden. As I was drawn closer, I recognized him as the man whose name had terrified millions. At first, he was barely recognizable, but I instinctively knew it was him. His body was burned and scarred beyond recognition, as if he had endured endless cycles of unimaginable pain. He was surrounded by flames that never seemed to go out. His suffering was distinct from that of the others, appearing to be customized to reflect the extent of his wrongdoing. He endured a cycle where he was burned, then healed, only for the torment to begin again. Around him, creatures, possibly demons, seemed to take delight in his endless agony. They tore at his burned skin, digging into his wounds and causing indescribable pain, but he could never die or escape it. He twisted in agony, his voice ragged from constant screaming. His cries were more intense, louder, and more piercing than the cries of the other souls nearby. The flames engulfed him but never let him disintegrate. As I watched in terror, something unexpected occurred. He looked directly at me. His burned, hollow eyes met mine, and for a moment, I was overwhelmed by an intense and crushing sense of despair. His expression held no anger or pride, only a sense of a broken, shattered soul. Then, to my astonishment, he started to speak. His voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it cut through the wails of the damned and reached me clearly. "I was misled," he whispered, his voice filled with deep regret. "Everything I did, all of it, I was misled." He stopped, struggling with his pain, his body racked with convulsions. "I believed I was following God's will," he said, "but it was all a lie. A dreadful lie." I stood there, unable to process what I was hearing. This man, who had inflicted so much pain and orchestrated some of history's worst atrocities, was now admitting he had been deceived. His whole purpose had been based on a falsehood. His words were heavy with regret, as if he had only discovered the truth too late, with no way to escape his suffering. Tears ran down his charred, scarred face as he begged with a broken and desperate voice. "Please forgive me," he sobbed. "I was wrong. I was completely mistaken," he pleaded. "I thought I understood the truth, but now I see everything clearly." His voice became more frantic, with a desperate, almost childlike hope, as if he thought that asking for forgiveness might somehow release him from his endless suffering. "Tell them," he pleaded, his eyes full of anguish. "Tell them I was mistaken. I don't want anyone else to go through this." "Please tell them," he implored, stretching out his hands toward me as if he thought I could rescue him from the flames. "I would do anything to undo it, anything. But it's too late for me. Please tell the world," he urged. "Don't let them be deceived." Like I was, his plea echoed in my mind, filled with such profound sorrow that it felt like it might shatter me. But I realized then that there was no redemption for him, no escape from the fate he had sealed. As I went deeper into the darkness, another figure appeared. It was Saddam Hussein. His body was shackled in chains, each link burning red hot and searing his flesh as he writhed in pain. His screams were guttural and broken, no longer the commands of a powerful dictator, but the cries of a tormented soul, forever ensnared in hell's flames. Demons surrounded him, whipping him with fiery lashes, their cruel laughter ringing through the air like a sinister bell. His skin was blistering and splitting, each wound more painful than the one before. But his suffering went beyond just physical pain. I felt an intense, unending regret gnawing at his soul, adding a deeper layer to his torment. His face, although charred and disfigured, still showed hints of the man he once was, proud and cruel, now reduced to utter despair. Through his pain, he gazed at me, as if aware that I had come to witness his suffering. His body quivered as he began to speak. "I was misled," he whispered, echoing bin Laden's words. "Everything I believed in, everything I followed, it was all a deception. I thought I was upholding the truth, defending Islam, but it was all false." His words, heavy with bitterness, revealed the deep regret of someone who had lived their life in false belief. "They convinced me I was doing God's will," he said, "that my rule and harshness were sanctioned by divine command. But it wasn't God's will. It was my own arrogance. my own thirst for control. His voice wavered as he said these words. The load of his admission was far too overwhelming for him to carry. His head drooped forward, with his scorched hands balled into fists, as if he was trying to grab hold of anything that might free him from his sins. I used God's name to excuse my crimes, he whispered, his voice fading. I brought suffering to my own people. I took the lives of thousands, all to cling to my power. But now, I understand I was merely a puppet. I was tricked. Fooled by my own pride and the empty promises of those who pretended to speak for God. His weary eyes looked at me once more, his voice growing with a frantic intensity. Warn them, he begged, his words mirroring bin Laden's last plea. Tell the ones who are still alive, the ones following the same deceptions I did. Share the truth with them before it's too late. Let them know that the path they're on doesn't lead to salvation but to ruin. Suddenly, everything shifted. The crushing darkness, the searing heat of the flames, and the cries of the condemned all disappeared. It felt like I had been yanked out of the pits of hell and thrown back into the land of the living. My eyes shot open, and I realized I was lying in a hospital bed. My chest rose and fell as I struggled to breathe. Each gasp felt like a lifeline pulling me back to the real world. For a moment, I couldn't make sense of what had happened. Was it real? The pain, the torment, the voices of the souls, it all felt so intense, more real than anything I had ever felt. My body quaked as I struggled to understand, coming back from a place so far from life, where hope was lost and suffering never ended. I had witnessed what comes after death, and it wasn't a calm rest. It was a place where the souls of the arrogant, the cruel, and the misled were punished without end. Despite their suffering, they called out to the living, warning them not to repeat their errors or believe the same deceptions. To my fellow Christians, I must be direct and urgent. Hell isn't just for people who don't believe. Many think that only those who reject Christ or are not believers will face hell, while believers are always safe. That's not true. From what I've seen, I observed the suffering of souls from every background and belief, including those who once identified as Christians. I realized that hell doesn't just target people based on their religion. What really matters is the condition of your soul and the choices you make with the truth you've received. This isn't about scaring anyone, but about waking us up to the fact that we're responsible for how we live, no matter our label. It's time for us to understand how serious it is to live in a way that matches God's holiness. Just believing or going to church isn't enough. We need to live righteously, follow the Spirit, and aim for a life that shows Christ's purity and holiness. The souls I met in hell frequently expressed their deep regret. Many had known about living a holy life but had tried to blend their faith with worldly ways, thinking they could mix both. This is what I've seen, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. Help save a soul by sharing this video with your friends and family so they can avoid the path to hell. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel to stay updated whenever we post new experiences we receive. May God bless you.